Magandang araw sa ating lahat. Ako po si Professor Shirley Guevarra, Dekana ng Kolehiyo ng Ekonomiyang Pantahanan. Ako ay isang food technologist na ngayon ay nagtuturo ng mga kurso ukol sa food service and hotel management sa ilalim ng Department of Hotel, Restaurant and Institution Management. Ang aming kolehiyo ay nakatuon sa pang-araw-araw na pangangailangan ng pamilyang Pilipino tulad ng pagkain, pananamit, tirahan at pakikitungo sa loob ng pamilya. Ang kursong FN1 na pinamagatang Food Trip ay isang general education course na binibigay ng Department of Food Science and Nutrition ng aming kolehiyo. Dito tinatalakay ang iba't ibang aspeto ng pagkain sa pang-araw-araw na buhay ng tao at lipunan. Pinag-uusapan rito ang social, cultural, economic, political at psychological na mga aspeto ng pagkain at mga praktikal na pamamaraan upang masiguro at mapabuti ang kalusugan at nutrisyon ng ating sarili at ng ating pamilya. Kasama ko dito ang mga guro ng kursong ito.
Ako naman si Dr. Blanca, Villarino, isang food technologist na nagtuturo ng mga kurso ukol sa statistics in food research, research methods at sensory evaluation.
At magandang araw po, ako naman po si Professor Airon Bonifacio, isang registered nutritionist dietitian na nagtuturo ng mga kurso ukol sa public health nutrition. Ako rin ang College Information Officer ng aming kolehiyo. Sa nakaraang mga segment na pinamagatang sakahan hanggang pinggan, ating tinalakay at sinuri ang iba't ibang aspeto ng food systems mula sa food production hanggang food consumption. Ngayon naman, sisimulan natin ang susunod na segment na pinamagatang Kainsaysayan, kung saan ating tatalakayin at susuriin ang food culture at culinary history ng ating bansa. So sa episode na ito, tayo ay magbabalik tanaw at susundan ang ebolusyon ng Philippine cuisine sa iba't ibang panahon ng ating kasaysayan. At sisimulan natin to sa panahon ng ating mga ninuno o ang pre-colonial period.
Ikinalulugod kong ipakilala ang ating kagalang-galang na panauhin. Felice Prudente Santa Maria has been a food historian, cultural worker, and culinary heritage advocate for 50 years. She pioneers Philippine food history and specializes in the Spanish and American colonial eras. She's the author of several award-winning books, including The Governor General's Kitchen, Culinary Vignettes, and Period Recipes from 1521 to 1935, The Foods of Jose Rizal, and the recently released Pigafetta's Philippine Picnic Book. Kumusta po kayo ngayong araw, Ma'am Felice? It's good to see you again.
Hi, Shirley! Buti rin, nagkikita tayo ulit dito sa isolation ng pandemiko. Busy tayo at marami tayong maaring to share, no? With lots of new material to share with the professors and the students and food enthusiasts through your initiative.
Naku, marami pong salamat at pinuunlakan nyo kami.
At taga-UP ata rin ako.
Naku, marami po tayong pag-uusapan, no? Kaya siguro magandang dumiretso na tayo sa ating unang tanong.
So magandang araw po, Ma'am Felice. Sa amin pong mga huling talakayan at sa aking profesyon, sariling profesyon bilang food scientist, aking napunan na ang pagkain ay napakahalaga sa Filipino culture and psyche. So bakit po kaya importanteng balikan natin ang history ng ating pagkain at intindihin kung paano tayo nakarating dito ngayon?
Well, ang kasaysayan, siguro alam natin lahat yan. Ang kasaysayan, history is looking back. As far as we can go, looking back. And by looking back at history, we can see the best and the worst of what people do. In terms of food history, the best and the worst of what people do to feed themselves and feed others. Because food history is actually the story of how we prevent hunger. That's the principal story of food history. And by looking backwards, we realize what were the events that threatened our food security? What were the solutions that occurred in the past? Can any of those solutions work today? Can they give us cues of what we should be doing to help us show that in our generation, our nobleness was there, our excellence was there, as we tried to feed not only ourselves, but how we could feed the common good. So that's why binabalikan po natin ang ating kasaysayan.
So maganda po sigurong i-relate yan sa nangyayari sa atin ngayon. So sa siguro mga 20 years from now, babalikan din po natin itong nangyari ngayon. So magiging part na po siya ng history. Paano po ba tayo nag-survive? Paano nag-survive yung food systems natin during this pandemic? Tama po ba yun?
Totoo yan. Totoo yan. Sa kasaysayan, makikita natin sa kasaysayan ng ating kulinarya, ng ating pagkain, at ng ating tubig. Huwag natin kalimutan, tubig. No? Makikita natin yung alam na nila na mangyayari. Alam na nila na baka mawala ang pagkain. So ano ang naging mga solusyon nila? So that is part of the story that I'll be sharing over the 3 episodes to which you have invited me.
Ma'am Felice, bumalik po tayo sa panahon ng ating mga sinaunang ninuno. No? What were the factors that affected our food waste during pre-colonial, prehistoric times? Based on archaeological evidences from those times, what can we assume were foods that our ancestors ate? And how were they sourced and cooked?
During our pre-colonial times, I would say that the focus of eating was for physical survival. So the pre-colonial period is the story of how our ancestors fed themselves to survive. And the pre-colonial period, as you have pointed out, is mostly prehistoric. So talagang archaeology. Galing sa archaeology, hindi galing sa written documents, ang mga conclusions natin. So what we know so far is the earliest food, no? The earliest food so far documented was rhinoceros. 700 to 750,000 years ago, our ancestors were eating rhinoceros. Nakita nila sa Kalinga na meron remains, the National Museum found remains of rhinoceros bones. Tapos may mga slashing talaga. So alam pinabutchering. Ang question, did they cook the meat of the rhinoceros or did they just eat it raw? Yun ang hindi pa natin alam. No? Tapos meron na ring prueba. This is the Ice Age. This is when this is still the period when we didn't have all these little islands, no? And these were not necessarily Homo erectus yet, or maybe they were not yet the Homo sapiens, but they were hominins, no? So all of this is still being worked out through archaeology. But what we know is that they were eating birds and they were eating, they were eating birds, they were eating fowl, no? And then we also know they were eating rhinoceros, they were eating deer. Kasi medyo flat pa noon eh. Wala pa masyado yung ating grown diptocarp forest, no? So the savannas were good for deer. Later, nung dumami na yung ating forest, yan, nag-abundance na rin yung wild boar. So we had rhinoceros, we had deer, we had some wild boar, and we found in Tabon a hearth. In other words, there was a fire inside a domicile, inside a home. And near that fire, near that hearth, were found the remains of bats and birds and things like that. So that's the first part of the prehistory. And then as the Ice Age ended, and the waters started to rise. This is where we have a very interesting addition to our prehistoric cooking, no? This is the age of the Austronesians already. So the early humankind that was still on the continent of Asia somehow had already figured out agriculture. So not only gatherers and hunters like during the early age, they already understood some amount of agriculture, and they were already beginning to invent better maritime vessels, because you couldn't walk anymore. The earlier stage, walking, foraging, hunting. Now, no, it's different. We have migrations crossing, sailing over to Taiwan, and from there, sailing over into Batanes and Luzon. And then the migrations would continue. So the Austronesian era, what we have there now is proof of the palayok. We have proof of the first rice growing. It was a wild rice. We know that dolphin fish was being dried. So here's the sense of we need to preserve our food for bad weather. We know that the water buffalo was around and that it was being domesticated. So we have all of this as our prehistoric era is about to now cross into what we used to call the AD period and what is now called the Common Era. So once the Common Era starts, there are two very interesting additions to our culinary culture. Around, maybe the 10th to the 13th centuries, this was when the Srivijayan Empire was picking up. And we had contact with the Indian traders. And sometimes you don't find the prehistory through material culture. We have to study words. And from India, for some reason, we still are not sure why. But our word for vinegar, suka, that is Sanskrit in origin. A very important word to Filipino cuisine is lasa, taste. Lasa also finds its etymology in Sanskrit, in rasa. So this is still part of our prehistoric culinary culture. And one of the other most significant prehistoric finds before the start of written history is out down in Butuan. The National Museum found fish bones, and they found the remains of a tabon-tabon fruit. Now, this tabon-tabon fruit was cut across, so you had two hemispheres, which is the way that today kinilaw is still made in that area. You cut the tabon-tabon fruit, and then you scrape out the pulp, and you squeeze out the juice. So this is before you had vinegar. Our kinilaw was you would squeeze out the juice, you would pass the raw fish in it, and that's your kinilaw. So as far as prehistoric evidence, that's where we stop first, and then we get into the written history in the pre-colonial food in written history. And of course, the archaeological remains continue to be found. But now we can go to written documents. They begin in the 1200s, in the 13th century. And they're just enumerations. Chinese were very big traders at the time. Salt was one of the commodities that they were exporting throughout the entire Southeast Asian region. And so the Chinese traders would note, oh, you know, in this island that just happens to now be part of the Philippines, they had rice wine. Oh, in this island, which just happens now to be part of the Philippines, they had rice or they had betel nut. But they're just one-liners. That's all, just one-liners, like an inventory. What is very significant is the year 1521. And that is when the very first written narrative about Philippine food started. Do you have any questions so far before I go into now the history part, the early history part of our pre-colonial food?
Actually, very impressive po yung pagkakalatag ninyo ng mga historical accounts.
Siguro, Ma'am Felice,
colonial period. Sir Airon,
ayan,
go ahead.
Nung yun nga sabi niyo, there are like single stories of, of evidences when Philippine food culture was starting, to take shape. No, ano po yung sa tingin niyo na what would be like, for example, like before nagkaroon tayo ng mga written records, would be like the general identity of, aside from food Philippine the early Filipinos having these traditions just to survive. Pero aside from that, ano po yung mga nakita po ninyo aside from just eating to nourish oneself, na ano po yung food for them?
In terms of unwritten stories, I don't dare conjecture as far back as the Ice Age. We know that they were nomads. They were wandering. In terms of the philosophy, for instance, I don't want to make any conjectures. As we come a little closer, though, into this era precisely where there is some written documentation. So we're now talking about the circumnavigation that started in 1519 and continued into 1522. There are hints already of Filipinos. Of course, we were not yet Filipinos. We had no concept of nation. We have many ethno-linguistic communities, and during that period of 1521, these ethno-linguistic communities were all quite separate, independent from each other. As early as 1515, there was a set of men from Luzon who were working as traders in Malacca, in the Portuguese territory. They were highly respected, and one of them, in fact, took on some kind of an officership in Malacca. And so the men from Luzon, for instance, they were not Muslim, they were pagan, and they explained that they had no king at that time. So we're talking 1515. They had no king. What they had was a council of elders. That was how they governed themselves in this area of Luzon where they were from. But as to where in Luzon were they from, no one knows. Okay, so now let's move from 1515, we get to 1521. So we get to the circumnavigation, and we have the records of Antonio Pigafetta, who was Venetian, and he was traveling on the flagship with Magellan. And so he provides us with written stories, observations, first-hand observations of the food, and in a way, the food ways, the customs of our ancestors in the areas of Cebu, Samar, going all the way down into Mindanao, all the way west to Palawan, because he was in the Philippine waters from March until about October. And during that period, he explained that the Filipinos were already, they lived in settled communities. They farmed. Okay, so you can see from an anthropological point of view that we have moved from the hunter-gatherer, we have moved into settled communities. We have our political structure where we have our daturships and the customs. The women are respected, the women also work. The women are also beautifully dressed with gold. There is a social structure of leadership and followers. So we have that on record in 1521. The foods that he found were, and he wrote about, so Pigafetta is the first to tell the world, to write it out for the world, that Filipinos in Central Philippines, our ancestors were cooking fish with broth, pork with broth. We were roasting fish and serving it with raw ginger. He described how we cooked our rice plain with water, and we cooked it in an earthen pot, which we lined with leaves. And he said, you know, they cook the rice in an earthen pot, similar to the way rice is also cooked in Spain. And he said, but they also have another way of cooking rice. They get a bamboo and they fill it with rice, and then they bury the bamboo, rice and water, and then they bury the bamboo in the ash. So they also cook it by roasting. And he also adds, during a religious festival, during a pagan ceremony, he saw that the pig was a sacrificial object. In other words, the pig had importance to the community. It had symbolic, had a symbol. And he said they have little leaf-wrapped millet cakes. They also have leaf-wrapped rice cakes, and these are used for the ceremony. So again, food was part of the religion. You had to feed the gods, not only feed yourselves. So here we get a little bit of insight into the workings of the pre-colonial community. And these were the people who, some of them were dressed using abaca fabric, some were using banana fabric, well, that's like abaca in a way. Some were using silks, some were using cotton, some were tattooed, some had gold jewelry. I mean, this is that period that Pigafetta saw. Are there any other questions before we move on?
You mentioned a lot of dishes, but what current Filipino dishes could have had their origins in those early foods that our ancestors ate?
During this period, we need to remember that the cooking was still very simple. Mm-hmm. We are dealing with a fire and a pot. Okay, a fire and a pot. We don't yet have evidence, for instance, of a clay hearth. So it's an open fire. Now, if we think about camping, Girl Scouting, Boy Scouting, survival training, try to imagine that that was where we were at. Cooking with a fire and controlling how to position an earthen pot above a fire, and how to maximize what we could do with an earthen pot. Also maximize what can you do roasting, okay? So we're very limited at that point. That's why broths. Now, Pigafetta doesn't give the common names for those dishes, but we very likely were eating, because when you boil in a pot, you are doing towa, And so the result is tinowa, or you are doing tola, and the result is tinola.
Okay.
So you could have that, and we would have naga. That would be the product of the cooking in a pot, the broth that he spoke of. Now, of course, when we talk about basic roasting, see, we have to think back. This is very basic roasting. So this is ihaw. If you make ihaw, you get inihaw. So that was what he tried. He has no record, by the way, of eating raw anything. He doesn't have that. So in terms of food history, we are limited. In other words, food history with a date prior to the coming of the Spanish, this is what we are limited to. We know that there was palm wine. He's the first to mention that we had vinegar made of coconut palm. He does not explain how we cooked or if we cooked with vinegar. All of this comes in the Spanish era. But in terms of pre-colonial, okay, we're limited, pre-colonial. We know that there was sugarcane. The sugarcane, you bit into it and you sucked out the juice. That was it then. They were eating turtle eggs. Okay? They could eat tabon eggs. They could hunt bat and probably roast the bat wherever they were. He speaks about cassava flour, tapioca, and how that was made into a bread, for instance. But that is as far as we know from written documents in the pre-colonial period. So remember, when you do history, whether we like it or not, we have certain constraints. Our evidence is what is written. In archaeology, their evidence, their constraints are by what they find, that they dig up. And but if we want to conjecture, if you want me to add to more information, conjectures from an anthropological point of view, that I gladly would do.
Ma'am Felice, I'm interested naman dun sa spiritual and socio-cultural beliefs ng ancestors natin regarding their food waste. No? What can you say about this?
We have tried to reconstruct this, I'm sure all of us realize. We've tried to reconstruct the spirituality, the religious practices of our ancestors. And what we can do is use the anthropologists and the findings of anthropologists who go into the most remote communities possible. Our anthropologists go to areas where perhaps there was very, very little contact between these isolated communities and foreigners. So what we have seen, for instance, some of the rituals that have survived and that clearly are pagan. So they are pre-Islamic and they are pre-Christian. The bulol, for instance, up in the Cordillera area, you have to have one male bulol and one female bulol. And the whole story of the bulol is actually the story of the proto-sculptor of the Philippines. And he was the man Wigan, who was taught by his brother, the god Wigan, his namesake, the god Wigan, how to carve these two bulol. And the idea was, there was a sacredness, by the way. There was a ritual once upon a time to this carving of the male and the female bulol. And you had to keep a pair at home. And one had to do the rituals to try to entice the spirits of your ancestors to come and live inside those two bulol. So again, if you ceremoniously fed these two bulol and the spirits of the ancestors, then the ancestors would be kind enough to provide a very fertile field and a bountiful harvest. So to feed your physical hunger meant that you had to be on good terms with the gods who controlled nature. Another ritual that I find very interesting, again, it is pagan, it is pre-Islamic, pre-Christian, is the kashawing ritual. And that one, what happens is the community divides into two. On one side of the field that is going to be cultivated, the men dress in red. The red symbolizes blood, the mortality. These are the people here on earth. On the other side of the field, the people dress in gold or yellow. Gold is symbolic of the divine. You know, surprisingly, red and gold, that is also the color of the Spanish flag. And it is in Spain, red for the people and gold for the god. You also see that in China, red for the people and gold for the emperor and the king, and the emperor and the gods. So for some reason, we find this commonality. Anyway, the kashawing ritual is done before the harvest. So the men in red go to the middle of the field. The men in gold come to the middle of the field where there is a hole. And in the hole are all these ritual offerings, including food. So in the kashawing, we see people and the divine, again, together with food, helping to convince the spirits of the gods to please come and help the field have a successful harvest. We also see, okay, here's another example, a little bit of insight into the pre-colonial Filipino. Some of you may have experienced what is sometimes called mangangalwa, meaning there are these young men and they pretend that they are souls. And this happens on All Souls Day. This is the Philippine Halloween, this mangangalwa. And the men, they don't dress in costume, but they go around from house to house and they sing. And the song says, "We are the dead souls. We are visiting you. And we expect you to feed us. If you don't feed us, we're going to commit some mischief. And you have to feed us rice cakes made of sticky rice. That is the food that we, the dead souls, like. You don't feed us the sticky rice cakes, we will steal your chickens." So again, you can see that this is, the gods are so important, pleasing the dead souls of the ancestors. Another part of being pagan is not only the ancestral worship, it's the animism, that the inanimate around us have souls, not just energy, but they have souls. And we see this in the fact that there are words that mean the soul of the grain of rice. Each grain has a soul. There are different words around the country. The Mandaya call the rice soul umayun. Now, even when Filipinos were already Christian, this sense of the grain being precious, the grain having a personality, having a, being alive, okay? People would say, when you put the grain in the granary, be quiet. quiet because you might offend the rice soul. These practices continue. And we will see in our episode about colonial food how all these ideas of feeding the physicality and being in the good graces of the divine, how all of this came into play and continued into the colonial era. So in pre-colonial times, to summarize, our pagan ancestors were eating to survive, and they were living a life that would keep the divine providing a natural environment that would feed not just the individual, but that would feed the community.
Wow.
Nako, Ma'am Felice, if I may add, we also have our own ritual in Pangasinan. We call it atang. To
Yes.
appease the spirits, when one is very sick. So
That's
we bring
right.
food under a tree or any structure in the backyard.
That's
And
right.
plead for healing. So atang is also done in front of the altar. So konektado to siguro sa sinabi nyo, ano ho? Kasi hanggang ngayon ginagawa pa namin po yung atang na yun eh.
What is interesting about food history, as we will see in the 3 segments, is pre-colonial moves into colonial. Part of it is still alive and becomes useful. It's just transformed a little bit, but it's still the same thing. And then what happens in the Spanish period is it continues into the American period. So we cannot get rid of our pre-colonial culinary personality, if you want to call it that.
Yes, ma'am. So maganda po yun, Ma'am Felice, na it would be a good segue to the next episodes po natin. Yeah.
Oo nga. Naku, maraming salamat po, Ma'am Felice, sa pagbigay ng panahon upang ibahagi sa amin ang inyong kaalaman at karanasan. Bago ho kami magtapos, bago ko pasalamatan ng mga kasama ko, mayroon po ba kayong final statement sa ating mga manonood?
Well, I just hope that our viewers, our listeners, that when you think of history, don't get turned off. Don't think it's useless. There is so much in the history, not only to provide us a link between who we are now, who we were before, and who we will become. It is very important that we look at history as a linkage, as a spiritual linkage, as a social linkage, because the identity of who we are as a people is revealed in history, and it's revealed in food history as well.
I like that. Very well said, Ma'am Felice. No? Ang laki ng respeto ko sa history. No? Hindi ho tayo makakasulong kung hindi ho tayo titingin sa pinanggalingan natin. So maraming salamat po ulit at gusto ko ding pasalamatan si Dr. Blanca at Professor Airon sa pagsama sa akin sa napaka-interesanting talakayan natin ngayon.
Maraming salamat po sa ating mga nakikinig at nanonood, at abangan po ang mga susunod na episodes ng Food Trip Kainsaysayan, kung saan ating ipagpapatuloy ang talakayan tungkol sa ating kasaysayan, sa ating food culture and culinary heritage. So paalam at malusog at masustansyang araw sa ating lahat. Paalam!